Okay, hello, welcome to our lunch study break. It is Wednesday, April 14th. I think there's still people coming in, but we're going to get underway here. It's a little afternoon. And one of the things that came up throughout Passover is a topic I wanted to get into a little bit. Some additional questions came up for me during one of my remarks throughout the holiday of Passover. I talked a little bit about the concept of the Mashiach. So as we know, in the second half, the Mashiach, the Hebrew word for the Messiah. So in the second half of our Passover Seder, after we begin in disgrace and suffering, we conclude in praise and Hallel. We open the door for Elijah. We sing Eliyahu Hanavi. And we hope that Elijah will come into our Passover Seder and will be telling us of the coming of the Messiah. And so I mentioned that I did this at my family Seder with just me and my wife and my two children. And they asked me after we got done singing Eliyahu Hanavi, and I closed the door. They said, "Who's Elijah?" I said, "Oh, Elijah is going to come. He's going to tell us when the Messiah is going to be here." And they said, "Who's the Messiah?" And I said, "Oh, the Messiah is the one who comes at the end of the world." And they said, "The end of the world?" And that was the end of the Seder. The Seder pretty much broke up at that point with tears and questions. And, oh, he's the guy who comes and he makes everyone happy. And they really got hung up on this idea of the Messiah and the end of the world. And a few people reached up, and I shared that story over Passover. A few people reached out to me and said, "Well, what is the Jewish idea of the Messiah? It's probably not as simple as you presented it to your children. And perhaps we can study that a little bit." So what I wanted to do today is take a look at this classic essay written by Gershom Sholom. Is everyone familiar with Gershom Sholom? A classic, great scholar of Jewish mysticism. Famous story. I don't know if it's true or if it's not true, but that never stopped me from telling the story. The story is that with Sholom said, well, mysticism is nonsense. That was the idea. But the study of mysticism, well, that's scholarship. All right, so that's the basic idea here. So that's the little funny idea from the perspective of Sholom. Sholom is coming from an academician's perspective. So what we're going to get here is history. We're not going to get homily. All right, now usually with me, you get a lot of homily. You might find different avenues here for us to begin to take homiletical approaches and to take mystical interpretations that apply to our lives now. And I want you to be welcome to share those with me as they come up. But for the most part, we're going to delve a little bit into the history of the Jewish understanding of the Messiah. All right, so let me open up the text here. Towards an understanding of the messianic idea in Judaism. This is from Gershom Sholom's classic book, which is called, and everyone, by the way, should have this. Everybody should have this book in any Jewish library. You should have Major Trends. It's just known by its first two words, Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, and that is where this article comes from. And I recommend that book very highly. So any discussion of the problems relating to messianism is a delicate matter. Can everybody read this? This is about as good of a copy as I have. For it is here that the essential conflict between Judaism and Christianity has developed and continues to exist. By the way, feel free to stop me and ask a question at any point. Although our discussion will not be concerned with this conflict, but rather with the internally Jewish perspectives on messianism. It will be of value to recall the central issue of this conflict. All right, so there's a different idea when we think about Jewish messianism and when we think about Christian messianism, and of course, the two holidays, happening simultaneously, Passover and Easter, the idea of the resurrection, it's common misconceptions will come up. So a totally different concept of redemption determines the attitude to messianism in Judaism and in Christianity. What appears to the one as a proud indication of its understanding and a positive achievement of its message is most unequivocally belittled and disputed by the other. Perhaps that's true. Judaism, in all of its forms and manifestation, has always maintained a concept of redemption as an event which takes place publicly on the stage of history and within the community. So we have this idea: creation, right? God created the world. Revelation, God revealed God's self at Mount Sinai, and then redemption, right? That is the idea. That is the flow of Jewish life: creation, revelation, redemption. And so we have this idea that a redemption will take place in history.
Rabbi?
So yes, go ahead.
Yeah, it's Judah. Do the Reform Jews believe in redemption?
Well, it's an interesting, I'm going to pause here for a second. It's interesting to say what the Reformed Jews do and don't believe vis-a-vis redemption or resurrection, because in their prayer book in the previous century, there is a key blessing in the Amidah: Baruch atah Adonai mechayeh hametim, blessed is the Lord our God who resurrects the dead. Now they removed that from their prayer book and replaced it with Mechayeh HaKol, blessed are you, the Lord who gives life to everything. And they have emphasized the concept of Tikkun Olam, which, by the way, as we will see, Judah, and I think as you rightly, maybe you are foreshadowing some of the conversations we're going to have in a few pages, but they do have an idea of redemption vis-a-vis litaken et haolam, to repair.
Okay, I don't know. I mean, first of all, they did bring back Hametim. The Reform movement has brought that back.
That's correct. They put it back. They put it back in their prayer book. That's right.
And I just brought this up now because I don't know when this book was written, but one of the last sentences you wrote was like, Jewish thought, no matter what, has always been based on these three things. And I don't think the Reform believes in resurrection, redemption. So maybe he wrote it.
I guess historically, that's right. I'm trying to see when the book was initially written. Hold on a second. He died in 82. So I'm not sure exactly when this was written. A triumph, possibly a miracle of scholarship, says the first review. Okay, so it's interesting, and how Reform view repairing the world is not inconsequential in this chapter at all, and I think is part of the Jewish understanding of what we mean by Messiah, because there is an idea of redeeming the world by repairing the world that we are all responsible to participate in. And that's really the area that has been most emphasized by Reform Judaism. Okay, so, Judaism in all has always maintained a concept of redemption. It is an occurrence which takes place in the visible world and which cannot be conceived apart from such a visual appearance. In contrast, Christianity conceives of redemption as an event in the spiritual and unseen realm, an event which is reflected in the soul, in the private world of each individual, and which affects an inner transformation which need not correspond to anything outside. Okay, even the Civitas Dei of Augustine, which within the confines of Christian dogmatics and in the interest of the church, has made the most far-reaching attempt to retain and to reinterpret the Jewish categories of redemption, is a community of the mysteriously redeemed within an unredeemed world. Okay, so I get a little lost with the Christian stuff, but what for the one stood unconditionally at the end of history as its most distant aim was for the other the true center of the historical process, even if that process was henceforth particularly decked out as what is called Heilsgeschichte, which is a word you might have heard me use. That is German, and that is the presence of God in history. That is when God comes and we find God manifesting God's self throughout history. All right. I want to get through the introduction, but it was just this conviction that always seemed to Judaism to be anything but progress. The reinterpretation of the prophetic promises of the Bible to refer to a realm of inwardness, which seemed as remote as possible for any contents of these prophecies, always seemed to the religious thinkers of Judaism to be an illegitimate anticipation of something which could at best be seen as the interior side of an event, basically taking place in an internal world, but could never be cut off from the event itself. Right? So what appeared to the Christians as a deeper apprehension of the external realm appeared to the Jew as its liquidation and as a fight which sought to escape verification of the messianic claim within its most empirical categories by means of a non-existent, pure inwardness. Everyone follow that? Everyone catch that? Anybody catch that? A little bit. I think what the point that he's trying to make is that the Christian chap, which I can't speak intelligently on redemption, talks about the redemption of the individual soul, right? You achieve eternal life by accepting Jesus as your Lord and Savior, and therefore that makes it about an internal, spiritual, unverifiable, extra worldly happening. And that doesn't seem to be the read from the Jewish prophets that we're familiar with. The Jewish prophets are talking about some sort of redemption on earth and a kingdom led by a human being who is going to be the Messiah, who is going to have this political redemption take place for all of the people and an ingathering in Israel. The move to a ethereal, internal, or spiritual realm seems to be far removed from the original intent of the prophets. I believe that is what he's saying here. But I don't want to focus too much on the Christian stuff because I want to focus more on the Jewish stuff. So let's go through, let me skip through here a little bit. Sorry, I have some difficulty navigating this. Did I lose a page there? I did. Okay. Here we go. Perfect. All right. The object of these remarks, I'm right here, is not the initial development of the messianic idea, but the varying perspectives by which it became an effective force after its crystallization in historical Judaism. In this connection, it must be emphasized that in the history of Judaism, its influence has been exercised almost exclusively under the conditions of the exile as a primary reality of Jewish life and Jewish history. This reality lends its special coloring to each of the various conceptions within which we shall be dealing with here. Okay, finally. Within Rabbinic Judaism as a social and religious phenomenon, three kinds of forces are active precisely at those points when it is most alive. Okay, so Rabbinic Judaism, we know, was created, the Mishnah, the Talmud, after the destruction of the temple. And there are three forces that are active according to Sholom. There is the conservative force, there is the restorative force, and the utopian force. The conservative forces are directed toward the preservation of that which exists and which in the historical environment of Judaism was always in danger. We are a conservative shul, so we are representative of this conservative force. They are the most easily visible and immediately obvious forces that operate in this type of Judaism. They have established themselves most effectively in the world of halakha and the construction and continuing preservation and development of religious law, everything we do at the shul. This law determined the nature of the Jew's life in exile, the only frame in which a life in the light of Sinaitic revelation seemed possible. And it is not surprising that it drew to itself, above all, the conservative forces. All right, so we have this idea, we have a conservative force that is understanding that it's in the exile, we're in the diaspora, and we're going to use halakha to protect and to conserve that which is always the most in danger in these circumstances. All right, so our practices, our law, our faith, our beliefs, our stories. Then there's the restorative forces. So the restorative forces are directed at the return and recreation of a past condition which comes to be felt as ideal. More precisely, they are directed to a condition pictured by the historical fantasy and the memory of a nation as circumstances of an ideal past. All right, so there are these restorative elements that perhaps want to rebuild the third temple. And here hope is turned backwards to the reestablishment of an original state of things and to a life with the ancestors. We dream of the rebuilding of the third temple and a return to the sacrificial cult. All right, so that's our restorative force. But there are, in addition, forces which press forward and renew. They're nourished by a vision of the future and receive their utopian inspiration. Okay, so we have the conservative force, which might express us to a certain extent, which wants to hold on to Jewish law, Jewish ritual, Jewish practice. And then Sholom says there is this other force, which is known as the restorative force. Maybe you can view this as a Haredi, ultra-Orthodox, or some of these people who want to rebuild the third temple and return us to the sacrificial cult. So it says this hope is found in a return. And then finally, there is this additional force which expresses a utopian inspiration, that they aim at the state of things which has never yet existed. To quote Bobby Kennedy, who was quoting, I think it was Frost, I forget who, some people dream of things that never were and ask why. I think of things that never were and ask why not, right? So they imagine things that have yet to exist. And the problem is with Messianism in historical Judaism appears within the field of influence of these forces, all right? So Messianism manifests itself in each of these three realms. How so? So to be sure, the conservative tendencies, great and even crucial as their role and their significance were for the existence of Jewish community, of Judaism, have no part in the development of Messianism within this community. Hi, how are we doing in our shul in terms of Messianism, right? We don't really have much of a part of Messianism. That's not really essential to a lot of the conservative forces, is what Sholom is saying here. This is not true, however, of the two other tendencies, which I characterize as restorative and utopian. Both tendencies are deeply intertwined and yet at the same time of a contradictory nature. The messianic idea crystallizes only out of the two, the messianic idea crystallizes only out of the two of them together. Neither is entirely absent in the historical and ideological manifestations of messianism. Only the proportion between them is the subject that has the widest fluctuations. All right, so there's never been in Judaism a measured harmony. We've never established a harmony between those who want to return to the temple cult and those who imagine a utopian factor. I guess that would be the tikkun olam element, Judah. Sometimes the one tendency appears within maximal emphasis, while the other is reduced to a minimum, but we never find a pure case of exclusive influence or crystallization of one or, these tendencies. The reason for this is clear. I'll get to you in 1 second, Marcia. Even the restorative force has a utopian factor. And in utopianism, restorative factors are at work. So the restorative tendency per se, even when it understands itself as such, as for example, in the case of Maimonides, whose statements regarding the messianic idea I'll get into, is nourished in no small degree by a utopian impulse, which now appears as a projection upon the past instead of a projection of the future. The reason for this too is clear. there is a common ground of messianic hope. All right, so we're discussing what is the difference between these utopian forces and these restorative forces, those who look forward and those who look backwards. The utopianism, which presents the common ground for messianic hope, is found here, where the utopianism, which presents the Jew of that epoch with the vision of an ideal, as he would like to see it realized, itself falls naturally into two categories. It can take on the radical form of a vision of a new content, which is to be realized in the future, that will be nothing, that will in fact be nothing other than the restoration of what was ancient, bringing back that which had been lost, the ideal content of the past, at the same time delivers the basis for the vision of the future. However, knowing, okay, he's a little bit academic here. I'm going to pause for a second because he's explaining himself several times over. Marcia.
Well, I guess I have a real problem with this whole idea of looking at the past and it's somehow it was perfect. Or,
oh, yeah, no. Yeah,
that it was something
that's right.
that was so devoid of flaws that we want to return to it. And the fact of the matter is, there is no time in the past, any nation's past, that even bordered on perfect. And our way of looking at circumstances and peoples with our values of today actually are embarrassed or at least remiss of a lot of things in the past. So this whole idea of restorative just doesn't make it. And
doesn't jive for you.
At the past.
But no, you don't fit into that force. I mean, I know that well enough about you that
Right.
You're not looking for some idyllic past that we can all return to, right? You're much more in line. And so this is the clash to a certain extent, the clash between the conservatives, us, to a certain extent, are on the sidelines. And then you have the clash between those who want to bring forth this utopian tikkun olam and those who want to take us backwards, back to Mount Sinai, back to some idyllic past. Marv.
This is all too complicated for me. I'd like to, could we have some grounds at where we're aiming? In other words, when we're using the term Messianic era, are we using this? What are some of the parameters? In other words, is this the time that the whole world will come to recognize the one God? Is this the time where King David line will be the line of the Messiah? Is this the time that Jews will all be ingathered into Jerusalem? Is this the time that all Jews will come alive again and their bones will be reassembled? I mean, do we have a common aim so that as I'm listening to all of this unfold, I can keep my mind together?
Yes.
I mean, are all of these things incorporated into this idea of the Messianic age? And when you use the term redemption, you mean redemption because we're going to be brought to life again, or because we're all going to live in this wonderful, peaceful existence? Give me a better idea of what the redemption's going to be. We're going back to Gan Eden and everyone's going to be there, or just Adam and Eve are going to be there without the snake?
So I can't do this as well as Sholom does this. So I'm going to try to show you how he does this. So I see their hands, but let me just try to see if I can clarify things for a moment or two. I shall now elaborate several principal structures of these forms, and in doing so, try to clarify the tensions they express. So ultimately, Marcia is expressing one of these tensions, the tension between the desire to go backwards, to restorative, versus the tension to go forward, to fix the world. Okay, so that is one of the tensions. How is that manifested, and how does he have to clarify the principal structures? He's going to now get into to explain what he means and when the messianic idea appears in Judaism. Ben. So I am going to get to you.
Yeah. So I got a comment and a question. So the comment is, I mean, I get Marcia's problems with kind of the restorative piece, but I think it's inevitable because we only have, we can't construct the future out of anything other than the past. We don't have experience of anything else. And a future that is completely unpredictable, which it has to be if we can't construct it out of either the present or the past, is frankly scary. And so I think it's impossible for us to have an idea of the future that isn't based in some way on either the present or the past, because we can't imagine anything else, right?
This is the beautiful tension, by the way, that exists, which is the Messianic age something that we can bring about, right, or is it something totally different and new?
Case in point, and this is maybe the question, is how can we tie this to, I think, the utopianism that is present in our own culture. We live in a place and time that is built on utopianism, specifically techno-utopianism in the Bay Area, right? I mean, this is now the you know, culture and business that we are surrounded by. And to my earlier point, I think we found that in techno-utopianism, there was an idea that certainly the internet would take us back to a time, right, when our communications were unmediated, right, when we were all on a level playing field, and we could, you know, we didn't have, you know, media in the way, and this kind of, you know, freedom of speech would you know, be this beautiful open marketplace. And it turned out that something completely different happened that had never happened before, but we couldn't we couldn't imagine that happening because it was emergent and really totally new. And so any future is going to have, you know, unintended sort of factors, and I think that's why nostalgia is necessarily a part of it, because it sort of guards against that. It allows us to say, well, it'll be just like all the good parts of the past without any of the bad parts, and that's very easy to imagine.
I'm guessing you might fall within the conservative tendency here, Ben. If I had to pick.
No, I don't. I think the utopianism of the Messianic dream is one of the best things about Judaism. I just think that I just think that it requires a massive effort to marshal the level of imagination needed to envision that. It's really, really hard, and that's why I see our life as Jews as a real struggle to try and put that together, and why also the Jewish ideal of practice, right, as a prerequisite, engages us in that struggle rather than just kind of making leaps that aren't really justified.
I like that a lot. And let's try to ground this as Marv asked us. And I think that's what Sholom is going to do here a little bit for us. So when this messianic idea appears as a living force in the world of Judaism, and I might ask you, do you think it's a living force now? I mean, we might say, yes, sure. Especially in that of medieval Judaism, which seems so totally interwoven within the realm of halakha. It always occurs in the closest connection with apocalypticism. In these instances, the messianic idea constitutes both a content of religious faith as such, and also living acute anticipation. So apocalypticism appears as the form necessary to create acute messianism. All right, that seems obvious, right? The end of the world is coming, and so therefore we need an idea of what the Mashiach is. So it is self-evident and needs no justification that the messianic idea came into being not only as the revelation of an abstract proposition regarding the hope of mankind for redemption, but rather in the very specific historical circumstances. So, all right, so back to Mars' question. When did this idea of the Messiah first come about? So the predictions and messages of the biblical prophets came to an equal degree from revelation and from the suffering and desperation of those to whom they addressed. They are spoken from the context of situations and again have proven effective in situations where the end perceived in the immediate future was thought about to break in abruptly at the moment. I mean, the end of the world might be like us all being inside our houses for a year, right? The end of the world is, oh, we're about to have a nuclear holocaust, right? The Russians are about to drop the bombs and it's going to be the end of the world, right? Oh, the end of, I mean, there's always this, right? 2012 or Y2K, right? There's this moment and situations where the end is perceived as being in the near future, is about to break in at any moment. To be sure, the predictions of the prophets do not yet give us any kind of well-defined concept of messianism. So I'm sorry, Marv, I don't have a real clear concept of it. We have a variety of different motifs in which the much emphasized utopian impulse. We have this vision, the book of Daniel, there's a vision of a better humanity at the end of days, is interpreted with restorative impulses like the reinstitution of the ideally conceived Davidic kingdom, right? So you can combine this Daniel impulse that at the end of days, the resurrected will come and rise up, and you can then combine that in a restorative sense to we're going to rebuild the temple and restore the Davidic kingdom. That's how the restorative impulse can sort of latch on to some of these prophetic motifs. This messianic message of the prophets addresses man as a whole and sets forth images of natural and historical events through which God speaks and in which the end of days is announced or realized, right? We read them in Isaiah. We read them in Jeremiah. You know, we're very familiar with this is what's going to happen. You behave this way. There's going to be a punishment, but at the end of days, a remnant will exist. I mean, we read these every Shabbos pretty much. Now, these visions never involve the individual as such, nor do these declarations claim any special secret knowledge gained from an inner realm not accessible to every man, right? We don't hear the prophets speaking like that. By contrast, the words of the apocalyptics reflects a shift in this view of the content of prophecy. So whether it's the book of Daniel, the two books of Enoch, these fourth Ezra, they're these the books of the Apocrypha, they get into, I guess, more apocalyptic. They encase words of the ancient prophets in a frame which they can mold and furnish in their own way. And he includes Daniel taking this idea of this utopian Messiah and applying it in his way. So here God no longer shows the seer individual instances of historical occurrence or only a vision of history's end. Rather, he sees all of history from the beginning to end with particular emphasis on the arrival of that new eon, which manifests itself and prevails in the messianic events. So the Pharisee Josephus had already seen Adam, the first man, as a prophet whose vision encompassed not only the flood in Noah's day, but also the flood of fire at the end of time, and thus included all of history. So that's not really how it's not how Isaiah talks. That's not really how Jeremiah talks, but we have this Pharisee named Josephus who is putting this all together from the time of Adam. And so I guess, Judah, you push back on this creation, revelation, redemption motif and narrative and said, well, that's a construct too. Yes, that's exactly a construct that is taken from the perspective of history. All right. So the Talmudic Agadah saw things very much in that way. God shows Adam, but also Abraham and Moses, the entire past and the future. So this is how the legends work. This is how Agadah works. We have an idea that the great prophets, Abraham and Moses, are given the full expanse of all of history. Likewise, the priest of the end of days, who appears in the Habakkuk commentary of the Dead Sea sectarians, will be able to interpret the visions of the ancient prophets regarding the total course of history of Israel, and all of their features will now become fully visible. So the idea is there's hidden mysteries in these prophets. Maybe you guys are familiar with the Bible code. Anybody remember the Bible code that came out 20 years ago? Oh, it's there. It's prophesying Rabbi Ain's assassination if you just plug all the letters of the Torah into a computer. And at the end of days, we'll know ultimately what the secrets of the revelation of the prophetic nature of these texts really are. That's an overlay which was given by rabbis and given by mystics and given by legends on top of our Hebrew scriptures. Judah.
Well, I just wanted to give a shout out to Jacob in the last couple of sentences you read. I mean, Jacob's the one who was supposedly shown the end of days. I mean, it's not in the Torah that Adam was or Moses was.
Well, that's right. And that's exactly his point.
But that Jacob was shown the end of days, and then it was taken away from him, so he couldn't tell his sons.
And I think what Sholom is saying is that that's a later rabbinic overlay and perspective that is added onto our prophetic ideas of this Messiah. All right. So these are the work of the apocalyptists themselves, motifs of current history, which refer to contemporary conditions and needs. They're closely intertwined with those of apocalyptic, eschatological nature, in which not only the experiences of the present exercise and influence, but often enough ancient mythical images are filled with a utopian content. So, as students of apocalypticism have always noted correctly, in this process, the new eschatology moves decisively beyond the ancient prophecies. Hosea, Amos, Isaiah know only a single world in which even the great events at the end of days run their course. Their eschatology is of a national kind. It speaks of the reestablishment of the house of David. Here you go, Marv, now in ruins, and of the future glory of an Israel returned to God. That's Hosea, Amos, Isaiah. Also of everlasting peace and the turning of all nations toward the one God of Israel, right? Those are the prophets we're familiar with. But then we have this apocalypticism which creeps in, and that produced the doctrine of these two aeons which follow one another and stand in antithetical relationship. There is Olam Haba, the world to come, and Olam Hazeh. All right, we've heard this before. This world and the world to come, the reign of darkness and the reign of light. So we have these two distinct realms of existence which are post-biblical, which come into our understanding. We've got this world, and what happens when we die, right? What do we tell our kids? There is Olam Haba. There's another world, a realm, a heaven that we go into. Now, there are lots of different ideas about what Olam Haba might actually be, and we'll get into those. So the national antithesis between Israel and the heathens is broadened into a cosmic antithesis in which the realms of the holy and of sin, of purity and impurity, of life and death, of light and darkness, God, and the anti-divine powers stand opposed. The national antithesis between Israel and the heathens is broadened into a cosmic antithesis in which the realms of the holy and of sin, of purity and impurity, life and death, light and darkness, God and the anti-divine powers stand opposed. A wider cosmic background is superadded to the national content of eschatology, and it is here that the final struggle between Israel and the heathens take place. So I'm going to finish this paragraph, then I think I'll explain. From there arise the conceptions of the resurrection of the dead, reward and punishment in the last judgment, paradise and hell, in which notions of individual retribution at the end of days occur in conjunction with promises and threats addressed to the nation. All these are conceptions which are now closely tied to the ancient prophecies. Here, all this stuff gets mingled up here, Marv. But the words of the prophets, which in their original context appear so clear and direct, henceforth become riddles, allegories, and mysteries, which are interpreted or deciphered by apocalyptic, homiletical, or an original apocalyptic vision. And thus we have the framework in which the messianic idea now begins to exert its historic influence. Okay, did we follow that? Did everyone get that? All right, I think I did. So we can start there. All right, so what he's saying is we have the Jews and we have the other nations. And sometimes the Jews succeed against the other nations, and sometimes the other nations take out the Jews. And when the other nations take out the Jews, it feels unfair, it feels wrong, and it feels like they're stronger than God. Well, that they can't be stronger than God. So therefore, the prophet said it must be because something that we did. God manifests everything in the history, so we are being punished from all of these happenings. And there is a point in time in the future in which we, as the people of Israel, will have our comeuppance and will, many centuries from now, whenever that might be, we'll be able to take back the land and defeat those enemies in the realm of history.
Rabbi, comeuppance means the opposite.
Explain.
Comeuppance means, well, you'll get what's coming to you rather than you'll be rewarded.
That's correct. They will have their comeuppance, and we will
have our victory.
We will have our glory. Exactly right. Thank you, Debbie. So that's our idea. But then we added this apocalyptic overlay to the text, which is everything that we come to know, which is a further separation between, well, what happens if we can't win in this world? What happens if something unjust happens in this world? We need another realm in which the righteous get their due reward. It can't just be on this earth. And so in the turn of the axial age, these ideas manifested themselves, and this idea that, okay, all of you might get screwed or killed, but ultimately 100 years from now, the people of Israel will go on and return. All right, but that's not fair. It doesn't seem right to the righteous. And so we create all of these ideas on Olam Haba, resurrection of the dead. We take this messianic idea that at the future, the nation of Israel will reign again, and we add a supernatural overlay, creates two separate realms, a realm distinct from history and the world itself, in order to intensify and amplify. How does he put it here? How does he say here? To give it a wider cosmic background. So it's not simply that the Jews and the non-Jews are doing battle on earth. It's that there is a cosmic war happening between good and evil that is played out for all of history. Was that better? Does that help? Maybe a little bit. All right. Let's keep going. Let's keep going on. There's an additional factor. As the meaning of the Greek word indicates, apocalypses are revelations or disclosures of God's hidden knowledge of the end. That is to say, what reached the prophets as knowledge, which could hardly be proclaimed with sufficient loudness and publicity, in the apocalypse now becomes a secret. So it is one of those enigmas of Jewish religious history that have not been satisfactorily solved by any of the many attempts at explanation. Just what the reason is for this metamorphosis, which makes knowledge of the messianic end, where it oversteps the prophetic framework of the biblical text, into an esoteric form of knowing. All right. So at some point, whereas the prophets shouted from the rooftops, there is this shift to, well, it's private, secret, esoteric knowledge going forth. Why does the apocalypticist conceal himself instead of shouting his vision in the face of the enemy power, as did the prophets? Sholom wants to know. Why does he load the responsibility for those visions fraught with danger on the heroes of biblical antiquity, and why does he convey them only to the select and the initiated? Is it politics? Is it a changed understanding of the nature of this knowing? There is something disturbing in this transcendence of the prophetic, which at the same time carries along with it a narrowing of its realm of influence. Interesting. It cannot be coincidental that for nearly a millennium, this character of apocalyptic knowing has always been preserved by the heirs of the ancient apocalypticists within Rabbinic Judaism. So there is, within Rabbinic Judaism, a bunch of heirs from these mystical apocalyptics, and for them, and maybe you've studied with some of them, I'm not one of them, but for them, it's about these chariots and mystical knowledge. For them, it takes, here, what is he right here? For them, it takes its place at the side of the Gnostic knowledge of the Merkavah, the throne world of God, and its mysteries, which, explosive as this knowledge in itself was, could be reported only in a whisper. I guess it's too dangerous, this knowledge, if it lets out. It has to only be reported in a whisper. It's too explosive. Not without reason, the writings of the Merkavah mystics in Judaism always contain apocalyptic chapters. The stronger the loss of the historic reality in Judaism during the turmoil surrounding the destruction of the Second Temple and of the ancient world, the more intensive became consciousness of the cryptic character and the mystery of the messianic message. I mean, it's like QAnon, if you think about it. It's like QAnon. There is this secret, only a selective cabal know about it. It's too powerful for it to even get out there to a certain extent. And it's an overlay that people can put on the entire nature of what's going on in our world to give everything a different meaning. And so there are these Merkavah mystics who are these heirs to these rabbinic apocalypticists. Okay, any questions here? Anybody totally lost? Okay, good. In an almost natural way. All right, I'm just going to move on here. Okay, good. Actually, hold on. Not without reason, the writings of the Merkavah mystics in Judaism always contain apocalyptic chapters. The stronger the loss of historical reality in Judaism during the turmoil surrounding the destruction of the Second Temple in the ancient world, the more intensive became the consciousness of this cryptic character of the Messianic Mages. Of course, the worse things get, the more people search for some secret that explains it all. In an almost natural way, Messianic apocalypticism orders the old promises and traditions, along with the newly adhering motifs, interpretations, and reinterpretations under the two aspects which the Messianic idea henceforth takes on and keeps in the Jewish consciousness. Okay, so there are these Messianic apocalyptic reorderings take place in two aspects, okay? These two aspects, which in fact are based on the words of the prophets themselves, concern the catastrophic and destructive nature of the redemption. So on one hand, the redemption is going to destroy everything we've got, right? It's going to reorder everything. And the utopianism of the content of realized messianism on the other. All right, so two aspects that whenever we talk about apocalyptics and messianic ideas, we're dealing with two aspects. What's going to happen to the world? It's going to be destroyed and overturned. And then what is the content of this messianic realm that we're entering into? Jewish messianism is in its origins and by its nature, this cannot be sufficiently emphasized, a theory of catastrophe. Okay, that is Jewish messianism, according to Gershom Sholom, and he can't emphasize that enough. This theory, oh, Don, yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking when you were talking about the destruction of the world, I see it, the apocalypse, as a destruction of the mind.
Explain.
That the apocalypse, that what will lead us into utopia is the destruction of the mind, the destruction of the hatred, the destruction of the anger, the destruction of the duality, thinking that it's either God or us or this or that it's really one, and that we are causing this. It's not God causing this. We are causing this, and that God will, I think, in the end, he will destroy our minds, and he will destroy the thought processes in our minds. And
you understand how that might be terrifying for people? Like,
absolutely. And some people will die because of that. They will be so terrified, they will physically die. They won't be able to handle it. And that's where I think the Jewish people, one of our jobs is to rise above that, so that when that happens, because it is going to be terrifying, probably for me, for sure, and I'm sure for everyone, but through the practice, like was mentioned before, if we have our practices and we have our faith, and that comes, we know why it's coming, we know that, and we'll be able to overcome it. And then at that
yeah, I
point,
think what Ben might argue with you and say, well, you can maintain those practices and rituals because the Messianic age is so radically different from what we know now that it's like a square. It would make no sense to be able to apply anything like that into the future.
well, you would, yeah, and in the future you wouldn't need the practices anymore, because the practices are only to overcome the destruction. So once you're there, you don't need the practices. You're in the garden again. You need no practices. You're only there naked with God.
No, that's a utopian impulse. Absolutely. It involves the destruction of our egocentric, egotistical, materialistic world, overthrown into the destruction of the boundaries that make us believe that we're any different or removed from each other. Okay, that's two aspects. You've covered both of the aspects that Sholom was talking about. One is what happens to the world. It gets totally overturned. The other thing is what's the content and the sum and substance of your sort of utopian framework. Ben, did you want to come in here? Or
well, since you invoked my argument, I'll
yeah, you can make it better. Make it better than me. Go right ahead.
I mean, I think this catastrophe is so cataclysmic. It just doesn't bear thinking about in some way. And what I like about, I mean, what I like about Jewish Messianism is this deep mystery, is this complete separation, such that we cannot skip to the end, the way that some Christian Messianists are often tempted, or maybe even some Jewish Messianists are tempted to do. That it's like, well, if this is what the end looks like, we'll just build that now, right? We'll repatriate all the Jews to Israel, right, as fast as we can.
That's right.
We'll find a red heifer, right? We'll do these things to skip to the end, so that we can actually make the world look like, Olam Haba, and then we'll be there. Whereas I think what Sholom is saying here is that, well, that's just ludicrous, because the Messianic Eon is on the flip side in some way that we can't even really imagine. And it's so divorced from where we are now, and on the other side of a catastrophe that we cannot really bring about ourselves. And so, like I said, it kind of doesn't bear thinking about.
I like what you said, because the only part I disagree is I don't think there's a value judgment from Sholom. That's the only part I might disagree with you. I think you guys are expressing, by the way, it's amazing we did this in 54 minutes as shakily as we did it, but we're going to continue this next week. Both of you are describing the heart of the conflict, which is going to be, do we and can we take it up into our own hands, whether it's by shaking a lulav or laying tefillin, bring about the Messiah, or the Messiah and the apocalypse? That's just going to come on God's time. We are little people. We're pishers. We can't possibly.
Well, no,
know
I'm
what-
not. I'm not. I would frame it differently.
You don't go that far.
I don't go that far. There's a difference between doing things that you believe are in the service. Well, look, how do we get to, it's tikkun olam, right? How do you repair the world through mitzvot, right? And there's a difference between that sort of framework that, yes, there are things that we can do, right? But that the cause and effect is a complete mystery, right? There is no cause and effect relationship that we can suss out between the mitzvot that we perform and the way that it brings about the
That's your no,
Messianic age.
That's
my
only,
perspective.
But that's only one of two. So that's one of two perspectives. Yeah, that's one of, and the Marxist perspective wouldn't agree with you. You know, like that's So and
this is also my problem with the folks that tend to talk about tikkun olam a lot, which is again like, well, if we want a world that is, free of hunger and pain and warfare, then all we need to do is feed the hungry and protest the wars. And and I don't think I think you actually need all the other stuff too. I think you also need the stuff for which there is no discernible cause and effect that we can suss out. Because if you don't need that stuff, then we don't need Judaism.
I mean, so that you're describing, that's mine. That's where I come down on this, but that's not where people who want to litaken et ha'olam, people who are actively working to bring this world into a more just place, they are working to repair the world on the system of, revolution and justice. And there are people who are working on the side of the street asking you to put on tefillin, because if every Jew puts on tefillin, that will bring about them. So you and I, both of those make us slightly uncomfortable. And that places us in one of the two categories that Sholom is going to get to, which I think are perfectly described here. I'm going to go on a little bit farther here because I want to just dip a little bit deeper into the catastrophe part. This theory stresses the revolutionary, the Jewish messianism in its origins and by its nature is a theory of catastrophe. This theory stresses the revolutionary cataclysmic element in the transition from every historical present to the messianic future. Well, we need to shift, right? At some point, we've got to move from Olam Haba to Olam Hazeh. How is that going to go down? This transition itself becomes a problem in that, beginning with the words of Amos and Isaiah, the really non-transitional character of it is pointed up and emphasized. So for example, what does it look like? Isaiah gives us in chapters 2 and 4, a day of the Lord. What's the day of the Lord? A day of the Lord is a day of catastrophe and is described in visions which stress this catastrophic nature in the extreme. But we learn nothing about how that day of the Lord, on which previous history ends and on which the world is shaken to its foundation, is related to the end of days promised at the beginning of chapter 2 of Isaiah, on which the house of the Lord shall be established at the top of the mountains and the peoples flow unto it. So the elements of the catastrophic and the visions of doom are present in peculiar fashion in the messianic vision. On one hand, they are applied to the transition or destruction in which the messianic redemption is born. Maybe you've heard of the birth pangs of the Messiah. I mean, maybe we're experiencing in our world, COVID is a birth pang, maybe. But on the other hand, it is also applied to the terrors of the Last Judgment, which in many of these descriptions concludes the messianic period instead of accompanying its beginnings. And thus, for the apocalypticist's glance, the messianic utopia may often become twofold. The new aeon and the days of the Messiah are no longer one. Rather, they still refer to two periods of which the one, the rule of the Messiah, really still belongs to this world, and the other, however, already belongs entirely to a new eon, which begins with the last judgment. So by this doubling of the stages of redemption, but this doubling of the stages of redemption is mostly the result of learned exegesis, which seeks to put every saying of the Bible harmoniously into place. In an original version, catastrophe and utopia do not twice follow after each other, but it is precisely by their uniqueness that they will bring to bear with full force the two sides of the messianic event. Okay, that is a very long way of saying I don't get it. I thought the Messiah was a human figure bringing about a human realm in this world, and now you Merkava mysticists want to tell us it's another world. You don't really understand the Messiah. First, the Messiah comes and takes care of this world. That's the first. And then there's the second otherworldly in which so that's their way of trying to synthesize all of the different threads together. Deborah.
I'm a little behind here, but I was just wanted to comment that trying to bring this end of days or Messiah by ourselves is kind of arrogant. Try to force the hand of God in some way is kind of futile.
This is my and Ben's, that's right. The idea that we human beings are forcing the hands of God seems a great hubris to me. It also makes God subservient to our actions to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Now you might say, well, God, and you could take a middle 20th century, nice liberal Jewish approach, which would say, well, God needs us to be a partner in creation. And so God needs us to meet God halfway, and therefore we have to do our job to repair the world by being part. That's often how that tikkun olam is expressed.
Unless it's a test like in classic literature, you have to do these 7 things before you reach your goal.
Yeah, like the hero's journey to a certain extent. Yeah. I don't love that. I
don't either.
I much prefer the Yor and Ben idea. Don, we're about at 1 o'clock, but I'll let you get the last word.
Okay, so if we are the children of God, if God is our creator, and then we say, it's almost like I hear it's like, well, we have no rights. We can't say anything. We can't speak to him.
There you go. There's the other element. There it is. That's right.
And if you have, for those of us who have children, we are the creator on the biological level of our children. And if our children come to us, even with crazy stuff, we don't smack them and tell them to go and you're stupid and you're too much imagination and all that kind of stuff. We listen as best that we can because they are our children. And so if we do that with our children, and we're sort of imperfect in the way we are at the moment, if God is as powerful as we claim he or she is, then what kind of listening does God have for us? And my sense is his or her listening is immense. And if we have anything of benefit, we're not little people, anything of benefit, God will take that and bring it to fruition at a level that we can't even understand. That just the littlest asking can bring forth great benefit to mankind. And that's our relationship, I think, to our Father.
So thank you, Don. That is a great way. That's a great other side of the argument, which is who are we? What are we doing here for? Why did God create us in the first place? What are we supposed to manifest? And to imagine that there's nothing we can do to bring on this end of days, then we're just ants who are waiting around for God to move. Now, the flip side, and we'll discuss this next week, Don, there's a lot of danger in taking power into your own hands and thinking that you're bringing about the end of the world and that you have the exclusive insight into what it takes to bring about the end of the world. There will be some danger along the way with that. I think we've seen throughout history that has bared itself out. So that's where maybe Deborah and Ben and I are we're a little bit more conservative, a little bit more. And then there's that utopian, which is like, that's why we're alive. That's our purpose. Thanos. Thanos is what Debbie writes there. So let me stop the recording here. Thank you, everyone, for